Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis. I am a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Blois Olson. He's a political analyst and publisher of Morning Take. Blois, thank you so much for joining me.
Happy to be here, Brittany.
I really appreciate you coming on and joining me because you must have had a really busy past couple of days because you broke the story that Minnesota Governor Tim Walz is dropping his reelection bid. And his departure from the race comes at a time when the state's government is embroiled in a billion-dollar fraud scandal. And for Walz specifically, this is a really stunning political trajectory, right? Because just a year and a half ago, he was the vice presidential pick. Now he's dropping out of the race. But if you could, to start off the conversation, walk us through your weekend. When did you see the writing on the walls that he was dropping out of the race?
Sure. I think there was a lot of speculation of whether or not, since last fall, whether or not his heart was in the race. And yet Democrats in Minnesota thought he was the best chance to retain the governorship. And so last fall, during our state fair, which is a great Minnesota get-together, there was this sense that maybe his heart wasn't in it. We had a school shooting during that time at Annunciation, and that seemed to ramp him up on issues like gun control. And so he did announce late September that he would run for a third term, which no governor in Minnesota has ever had. And then since then, we've just really had this thread of fraud issues. And so over the last couple of weeks, months, there was this sense, can he survive these fraud scandals or is he too damaged? And then last Friday, I got news that he was meeting with his family and that there were serious cracks in the foundation of his political base. And then Sunday got word that he had scheduled an all-staff meeting, a cabinet meeting, a campaign meeting, all within a couple hours. And then my sourcing just told me that the writing was on the wall. He was not going to run again.
And then he had a meeting with Senator Amy Klobuchar, and I can imagine they just weren't talking about the weather. So if you could, based on what your sources have told you, what you've gathered, bring us into that room of the meeting. Whose idea was it for him to drop out? Did he say it? Did Amy Klobuchar suggest it? What did that really look like?
I think, again, go back to last fall. If Walz wouldn't have run, Amy Klobuchar was making preparations to run last fall. And so she had already scenario planned out whether or not she was going to run. She is the dean of the Democratic Party, the senior member in Minnesota. And so I don't know exactly what happened in that room, but I think she was prepared to say, I'm going to run if you don't. Or Walz had already made up his mind. The sense is that Governor Walz had already made up his mind. His family's been under extreme pressure, security threats, et cetera. And we did have an assassination here of our House Speaker last summer. And so violence in politics is real to Minnesota elected officials. And I think all of the combinations, the pressure on fraud, the finding of the energy to run for a third term, and then party pressure within the DFL from Senator Amy Klobuchar, other legislators, I think just, there was never one thing. I think there were multiple things that made Governor Walz make this decision.
And then when you look at Walz as a candidate, this fraud scandal, which we will dive a little deeper into, really made him a weak candidate. The Republican field is very crowded for this race. If I'm someone like Minnesota House Speaker Lisa Dameth, if I'm waking up to this news, what am I thinking? Because a lot of the Republicans are running on, hey, Democrats are responsible for this fraud. We can fix it. Now you wake up and Walz, who is really the face of this fraud in Republicans' eyes and a lot of people in the state's eyes, he's out. What does this do to their campaign?
They're going to refocus. They're already refocusing. They're trying to tie Amy Klobuchar to Tim Walz already 2 days after he's already dropped out. Lisa Dameth is the speaker. She's one of the leading candidates. Kristen Robbins is the chair of the fraud committee. So this crowded field is going to kind of sort itself out probably in the next 6 to 8 weeks of who has the best chance. But finally, I think one of the things that Republicans are trying to figure out is not just whether or not they're running against Amy Klobuchar for governor, but how damaged is the Democratic brand in Minnesota? Republicans have not won here for 20 years, and so statewide. And so that becomes one of the considerations is who's the best Republican candidate. The other factor here is that Governor Walz isn't going anywhere. He's just going to be a lame duck for the next year. He's going to be visible. He's going to be loud in his view against the president. And so I don't think he's going to help make the fraud stories go away. We had another fraud story break yesterday, and we anticipate more prosecutions, more examples in the coming months, which will keep Walz in the spotlight.
And then when you're looking at this race overall, do you think that A, when is Senator Amy Klobuchar going to announce either way that she's jumping in the race or she won't? And B, at that point, do you think that it would be her race to lose? And I know that we still have a long way to go here. You don't have a crystal ball, but what are you thinking?
She clearly changes the narrative. She is a very strong performer. And Republicans are worried that maybe they push Governor Walz out of the race too early because Senator Klobuchar has performed better in rural areas than Governor Walz and other Democrats. And so she does have more statewide appeal traditionally when she's been on the ballot. And so it's still hers to lose, but there is a lane for Republicans to win. They just need the right candidate and the right resources to make it a very competitive race.
And then when you're looking at the fraud story, when you're looking at Governor Walz dropping out of the race, I mean, how are Minnesotans feeling? What is the temperature there in the state?
The mood of Minnesota is really interesting to follow, and that's the way we think of it. When he announced that he was running for reelection, 50% of Democrats said he should not seek a third term. So even within his own party, people had felt Walz fatigue. Then that merged into fraud fatigue. And in most recent polling from our firm, Fluence, we have seen that less than 45%, so 41 to 43% favorable rating and a high 40s unfavorable rating. So the first time in 7 years since he announced re-election, since more fraud stories have broken, Governor Walz is underwater in favorability.
And I want to talk about this fraud story because obviously it's been a huge story dominating your state's headlines for months. It really came into some national headlines last month. A federal prosecutor said 14 Medicaid programs were flagged as having significant fraud issues. He suggested at least $9 billion could have been fraudulent. This is what he said about these fraud schemes in Minnesota. The fraud is not small, it isn't isolated. The magnitude cannot be overstated. What we see in Minnesota is not a handful of bad actors committing crimes, it's staggering industrial scale fraud. It's swamping Minnesota and calling into question everything we know about our state. I mean, that is really serious. And then this blew up. It really came to a fever pitch at the end of December. A 23-year-old content creator, he posted this 43-minute-long video, his name's Nick Shirley, of him going to different daycares in Minnesota and trying to investigate these fraud schemes. But before we talk about Nick Shirley's video, can you just give us an overview here, a brief explainer of just how big these fraud schemes in Minnesota are?
You know, I think the real story is we don't know yet. We don't know the depth and the scale of the fraud. However, when a U.S. attorney who is a career U.S. attorney, assistant U.S. attorney, not a political appointee, makes those claims, and we know that the U.S. Attorney's Office has advised the governor's office just how deep it is, but the sense is the governor didn't respond, didn't take it seriously enough, that's the case. There was another fraud, multi-million-dollar fraud revealed just this week in behavioral health. Those audits from nonpartisan independent auditors have continued to come over and over again. We anticipate probably 8 to 9 more new examples of fraud in the coming months. And then you have the ongoing story of the prosecution, the investigation. These stories are not going away for the state of Minnesota.
This fraud scandal is huge, right? Because federal prosecutors are saying this isn't an isolated incident. We don't even know how much fraud there could be. There could be $9 billion worth of fraud. It could be more. I mean, when you're looking at the responsibility here, how much of this really falls on Tim Walz, A, and B, do Minnesotans get the sense at all that he has taken adequate responsibility for this?
Brittany, I think this is a great question, especially for Forbes. Governor Walz is the CEO of the state of Minnesota. If any CEO in any organization, for-profit, nonprofit, public, private, had these kinds of issues, the board would remove them. And that CEO would take some accountability. They would know they had accountability. It is very clear that 60+% of Minnesotans in most recent polling don't believe Governor Walz has taken accountability, don't believe he has done enough to fight fraud. And when any time during this divide that we have in our country or in our state, 60% of people agree to something, that kind of sets the mood. Governor Walz, and I've watched him since 2006, but clearly watched him very closely as governor, have moderated multiple debates with him, have talked to him, known him. He has an aversion to take accountability. And we've seen it time after time. And I think it really became his political Achilles heel.
And why does he have that aversion? Because when he came on the national stage, he had this appearance. A lot of people took him to be, that goofy dad, maybe that Midwestern dad, lovable dork. Is that how Minnesotans see him, or do they see him as someone who is shirking away from the responsibility of saying, hey, I owned this fraud scheme that was happening under my watch?
I think you have to look at the kind of the spectrum and the timeline of his service. He ran in 2018 on One Minnesota, uniting the state. This is just after 2016. That was a very appealing message. Then we had a pandemic, not his fault, but how he responded to the pandemic became an issue. Then we had the killing of George Floyd and the riots. Again, not his doing, but how he handled it became the issue. He won re-election in 2022 against a fairly weak Republican opponent in a year when Democrats had a surge due to the Supreme Court on Dobbs. And then I think everybody was like, all right, we're going to set for the second term. Let's stabilize everything. And things over the last 3 years did not get more stable. In fact, Governor Walz, away from fraud, with a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate, spent an $18 billion budget surplus. They raised taxes by $10 billion more. And in his third term, had he run, he would have faced a $9 billion deficit. So separate fraud. That does not have anything to do with fraud. Minnesotans just started to say, like, do we have a vision and a plan that we all can rally around for the future of the state? And I think that's what the other piece Governor Walz failed to figure out.
I know you said almost that his decision to drop out was death by 1,000 cuts. It wasn't one thing. It was a culmination of things. Was that last thing, though, the Nick Shirley video? Because that went massively viral, racked up hundreds of millions of views on social media. Vice President J.D. Vance tweeted about it, or posted on X rather. Elon Musk posted about it. I mean, it was really just shocking what the video, how much attention it gathered. News outlets, daycare workers there, they've pushed back on the claims that Nick Shirley was making. But was that the thing that pushed Walz over the edge?
I don't know if that video did it, but the fallout and the response to that video was it. I think it's a lesson in the way modern media and social media work. That video was posted on December 26th. It's a quiet time. It's a holiday time. People are spending more time with their phones. And there was a vacuum of response. There was literally no response from the governor's office for days. And that is what we saw in the days following the George Floyd riots. It's what we're seeing today. No public events after another audit came out yesterday that showed backdated documents. So this is the cycle. What I would also say is that people within his own party who wanted more independent audits done of state government really got fed up once Nick Shirley's video came out. And it gave them proof to say, you're losing the narrative, you're losing the facts. We talk a lot about separating signals and noise. Nick Shirley's video created a lot of noise, and it wasn't all entirely accurate. However, the threads of accuracy, the signals within that video that were fact and were real, are the things that are indefensible if you're the sitting governor of the state.
And now, obviously, this is a national story, but you've been covering it from the beginning. So when you're looking at how it gathered all of this attention, do you think the national dialogue surrounding the governor's race, as well as these fraud schemes in Minnesota, do you think anything's missing from that conversation?
It's a great question. I think in a short attention span world, I think any kind of audit or investigation takes time. And so I think the impatient American, the impatient Minnesotan wants all the news. They want all the information right now. So it's really tough to speculate on kind of what's missing. We are supposed to get a full report on some of the program audits at the end of January. That will give us, I think, a view of how wide this is, not how deep it is, but how many programs it impacts. The sense is right now this is 12 to 14 state programs that are funded in part by the federal government. If that expands to 20 to 30, then that's a major issue. I would also say that there was a warning sign, and the warning signs on Walz came not just from local media, but CNN did a full investigation piece in October of 24 when he was running for vice president about 12 cases where he did not pay attention to independent audits. And so I would just urge your viewers to know that there's been reporting out there, but as with anything, what cause? Where is it at? Somebody, one of the reporters this week referred to this. Is this a Watergate, Minnesota moment? Is there so much stuff that we don't even know yet that it'll deteriorate trust for a long time? And I think that's what we'll follow for the next 11 months.
And to that point about deteriorating trust, I mean, is this Walz's legacy now? Is this the DFL's legacy in Minnesota now? Because I just can't get over that federal prosecutor saying this calls into question everything we know about the state. I mean, it sounds like what he's saying is everything we know about Minnesota essentially is a lie. Fraud was the norm here, not the outlier. What does that do to the legacy of Democrats and Walz?
I think the first thing you have to realize is Minnesota is a good government state. Minnesotans are not super conservative as a whole. They're not super liberal as a whole. They believe good government services are worth paying for. This calls that fundamental piece into doubt and erodes that trust. Now, there's plenty of parts of government that still work in Minnesota that aren't littered with fraud. But I've said this for a few years. I think what has been missed is the idea of getting back to the basics. Back to the basics on education, back to the basics in public safety, back to the basics in good roads and good schools. And I think that's where, if Democrats survive, they have to focus this. And if the midterm is bad for Republicans nationally, but good for Republicans in Minnesota, that will give evidence that there is an independent streak. And if you don't trust the institution or the party running the institution, that's a warning sign, I think, for the future of all political parties and political leaders.
And when you said back to the basics, I was thinking back to the basics of journalism. One of the questions, obviously, when you're a journalist is how. And I'm thinking back to the very beginning of this conversation. I mean, how did this happen? I was listening to WCCO yesterday. A lot of Minnesotans sounded really fed up. They felt that they were forgotten about where they live in their state. They're fed up with Walz. They're fed up with this fraud story. Is there a sense in Minnesota of understanding exactly how this happened? Or because, as you said, pieces are still being uncovered, there's not an exact number of how much fraud there has been happening out there. Is there a sense yet of how this happened?
I would chalk it up to three things. One is Minnesota nice. We don't want to be super mean to people. Oh, you made a mistake. Minnesota passive aggressive. Maybe they didn't ask aggressive questions as journalists fast enough or hard enough. And then, the noise of the partisanship and the polarization we hear dominates the conversation when the real facts about the fraud didn't get out or people didn't know them. They have such an emotional reaction. So how did it happen? I think it's complex. And I think that's the unraveling that people are waiting to see. And the reality is journalists have requested documents, reporters have requested interviews, and people have not been made available. And I think one of the things that I think people are starting to realize is that if you're not willing to talk and you're a public employee, or you're not willing to let documents go, and they're public documents that you could release, that maybe you're hiding more than you are. And then that becomes where we learn how, Brittany, is how did it happen once we get in there. The last piece on that is that, nationally we talk about the Epstein files, and that is a lot of noise and a lot of things. Well, none of the Minnesota fraud files have been released by the governor, and he can approve releasing them. So I would say that could be where we learn how, but it also could be more of the downfall and more of the legacy of Tim Walz if he doesn't release those files. Because I guarantee you the next governor will be forced to.
I heard you talking about this yesterday, and you said something Like your spidey senses go up as a journalist when people stop talking. And I agree with that. Once you hear radio silence from someone, you know, hey, I'm onto something here. There's a story here that needs to be uncovered. So as the person who is the or one of the leading reporters on this story, your boots on the ground there, what specifically are you looking out for next?
So just to be clear, I'm an analyst, not a reporter. I do not make my living as a journalist. I just want to be clear because sometimes people push back and say you should do more, or people say you're not a reporter. We analyze, we look at trends in the politics of things and the policy of things. What am I looking for next? I'm looking for the thread to pull on or the thread that other people pull on. And I'll give you an example. In the last 24 hours, this latest audit that came out, the governor's office, his administration, received the draft copy of that in the first week of December. So they had a month to get ready for an audit that said documents were backdated and documents were created after the audit began, which everybody knows is a big no-no and is not good practice. And the state independent legislative auditor called them out on it. She also said another thing. This is the first time we found it, even though we've suspected it in the past. And that's a thread to pull on. It also goes to show that for a month, his administration knew that this audit was coming on Tuesday, January 6th, which makes the idea that he had to make a decision over the weekend about whether or not he could survive another bad audit and another investigation, a moment that he probably really had to think about how he was going to answer those questions. Lastly, he planned his press conference yesterday at 11:30. The audit came out at 2, and there's no media appearance today, and there's no statement today. That's the silence that keeps me curious.
Blois, I really appreciate you coming on and talking about everything that's happening in your state. And as we see more developments out of Minnesota, I hope you can come back on and join me for more conversations. You're welcome back anytime.
Thanks. And people can follow our work at thedailyagenda.com. And we post multiple times a day there about kind of what happens in flyover country here in the Midwest.
Well, I appreciate it, and we will be checking it out as well.
Sounds great. Thank you.